Mr. President, last week, the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit issued an emergency stay on President Biden's sweeping vaccine mandate. The court granted the stay, citing, quote, grave statutory and constitutional issues with the mandate. The 22-page order is persuasive and compelling in explaining the grave effects the mandate will have on businesses and individuals alike throughout the United States. The order also explains that the limited nature of the federal government under the Constitution simply doesn't allow for sweeping mandates of this nature generally. But it certainly doesn't allow for sweeping mandates like this one without an act of Congress. You see, our powers within the federal government are carefully circumscribed. They're carefully constrained. The Constitution brings about a balancing, a limitation on powers that operates along two axes. The vertical constraint is called federalism, and the horizontal constraint is something we refer to as separation of powers. The federal government's powers are, as James Madison described them in Federalist Number 45, few and defined, while those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. Likewise, within the three branches, we have these protections in place to make sure that no one person can exercise what power the federal government does have exclusively. They can't accumulate too much power. And so the President of the United States, under our constitutional system, isn't a king and may not rule by decree. He's not free to just do things because he thinks they're a good idea. The judges also refreshingly asserted the Commerce Clause of the Constitution and brought up the Commerce Clause as the source of the claimed authority for federal action in this circumstance, noting that even under broad interpretations of the Commerce Clause that we've seen from the federal court system since 1937, the Commerce Clause is not unlimited in the scope of the authority that it provides to the federal government. And in this case, it certainly doesn't occupy the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to issue a sweeping vaccine mandate for all companies with more than 99 employees. Nor does the Commerce Clause even authorize Congress to undertake such an action, which of course Congress has not undertaken. We've erred dangerously over many decades from the true application of the Constitution's limits. In many respects, we've lost sight even of the fact that this is a government of limited powers. And now the lack of those limits, the lack of respect for those limits within those who operate the federal government, is placing millions of Americans at risk of not only becoming unemployed, but in many cases unemployable. Some in Congress are today taking it even farther and asking the President of the United States to impose a vaccine or test mandate as a condition precedent for interstate travel. Now, I've heard from hundreds of Utahns who are at risk of losing their jobs because of this now thankfully halted mandate. These are not bad people. To the contrary, they're good people. They're our neighbors and our friends. They're everyday Americans who are all too often just trying to get by, to provide for their families. They're not our enemies. And it's troubling to think that the President of the United States said on national television, no less, that he's, quote unquote, losing his patience with them. What does that even mean? In fact, recent polling numbers show that if anything, it appears to be the other way around. We're losing patience with him and with his broad assertions of authority that he doesn't even have. Now, I've come to the Senate floor about 15 times now to oppose this vaccine mandate. I've offered a dozen bills to limit, clarify, or otherwise counteract the vaccine mandate. Each time, one or another of my colleagues from the other side of the aisle has objected to what should be uncontroversial bills. Let's review each of these that we've gone through so far. Now, this started back on September 28th with S-2850. This bill, S-2850, would have provided exemptions for those with religious or moral objections to the vaccine mandate. President Biden significantly had promised these exemptions would be in the mandate. But for some reason that I struggle to understand, Senate Democrats nonetheless objected to passage of that bill. So then I came back and I offered up S-2840, the Don't Jab Me Act, a bill that would require that the federal government make those who suffer from the vaccine mandate to be made financially whole. Democrats rejected that bill too. Next, I offered S-2843, the No Taxation Without Congressional Consent Act, a bill that would require congressional authorization before the fines associated with the mandate could be charged to businesses. Notwithstanding the fact that the Constitution is very clear about where taxes need to originate within our system of government, Democrats objected to that bill as well. So then I came back with another bill. This time it was S-2848, the Your Health Comes First Act. This is a bill that would offer exemptions from the mandate to those who have pre-existing medical or other health concerns about the vaccine. This is also another exemption that President Biden himself promised in his speech first announcing the vaccine mandate. But it's an exemption that the Senate Democrats apparently didn't feel worthy of codifying with legislation, and so they objected to that one too. This one was particularly surprising because if, in fact, President Biden himself felt comfortable with those exemptions, one would think that there wouldn't be discomfort with codifying what he himself should be the law. So then, in response to that, I returned to this chamber on another day, and I offered up S-2846, the Natural Immunity is Real Act. This bill would require that the federal vaccine mandate recognize natural immunity. Countries across the world recognize this immunity for the powerful protection that it in fact provides. Protection that, according to some studies, may be as much as 27 times stronger than that offered by the vaccine alone. Unfortunately, President Biden's mandate wasn't so generous on that point. But this bill, too, was rejected by the Democrats, disregarding science, showing the very real impact of natural immunity. So I came back and I offered up S-2847, the Let Me Travel America Act. Now, this bill would prohibit the requirement of vaccination before citizens could travel between the states. Apparently, Democrats want to leave that option open because they objected to that one too. Well, that one's not in the vaccine mandate. It's feared, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that that might be on the table. And apparently it still is, because people were unwilling to codify what should be a natural conclusion for most Americans to reach, which is that our right to travel from one state to another without permission from the federal government ought not be interfered with, that it's fundamental, that we shouldn't mess with it. That's why it was unfortunate that this one, too, drew an objection. So I returned. I hope that this body could give some assurance and some respect to the brave men and women of our military who are at risk of losing benefits and losing the right to serve over this vaccine mandate. So my bill that I offered that day, S 2842, the Respecting Our Service Members Act, would protect service members from losing their livelihoods and the benefits that they've accrued and earned through their valiant service as a result of the mandate. The Democrats objected to this one, too. That's particularly sad. These are heroes. These are people on whom we rely to keep us safe. We got to give them more trust than that. We got to not put them in a position in which many of them are facing a difficult decision. So I offered another bill. I returned to this body and I offered a bill that should be one of the least controversial measures that we've ever considered, not just about the vaccine mandate, but about anything. That bill, the Parental Consent Before Vaccination Act, would have simply required that parental consent be provided before COVID-19 vaccines are given to children. Democrats objected to that as well. So I came back and I offered the Transparency in COVID-19 Vaccination Act. This bill would have provided information regarding vaccine side effects to the public. It would have just made sure that the American people have access to that information. I thought information would build confidence in the vaccines. The Democrats disagreed, and they objected. Apparently that was too much. I don't know why people wouldn't want more information. I actually think that would have built confidence in the vaccine, but apparently they didn't see it that way. Or maybe they just didn't want people to have access to the information. I don't know. I can't speak for them. I just know they objected. So I came back for the 10th time. I offered up the Transparency in COVID-19 Research Act. This bill would have provided research and information drawn from that research that the American taxpayers are paying for to the public. That should be available to the public. We pay for that research. We ought to know what the findings are. I thought the government shouldn't have anything to hide, wouldn't have anything to hide here. But the Democrats disagreed, and they objected to that one as well. So I tried again. I came back and I offered up S 2851, the Transparency in COVID-19 Expenditures Act. This bill is just a good housekeeping measure. It's a common sense measure. It's not something that should have been either liberal or conservative or thought of as Republican or Democratic. It's just a good housekeeping matter. You know, I think it's strange that it would be controversial, given the simplicity of what it would do. It would simply call for an audit regarding how our COVID-19 funds have been spent. I thought the information would be helpful to us as we make policy moving forward, and yet Democrats objected to that one. So I tried again. I offered a 12th bill that would simply end the mandate. The No Forced Vaccination for COVID-19 Act would clarify that federal law does not authorize OSHA or any other federal agency to implement a general vaccine mandate. But the Democrats objected to that one, too. 12 times, Mr. President. 12 bills. Now, some were simpler than others. Some should have involved no controversy whatsoever. Some just asserted good principles of lawmaking or constitutionalism generally or federalism in particular. And each one was rejected. One right after the other, repeated 12 times. Thankfully, while some in this body have floundered, judges on the Fifth Circuit fulfilled their duty to the American people and their oath to the Constitution. That does not mean, however, that this fight is anywhere near over. It will continue in the courts, where the states and the Biden administration will each be able to make their case. But I'm also going to continue this fight here. I'll stand for those Utahns and those Americans who are at risk, specifically because of this mandate. It's also important, Mr. President, for us to remember that separate and apart from what the courts might do, we have an independent obligation, having each taken an oath to uphold and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. In the fulfillment of our duties, we need to make sure that before authority is exercised, especially authority operating in such a personal manner on such a personal issue as this, that power isn't being taken from those to whom it belongs. The power in our system of government belongs to the people. And in the absence of a delegation of power to the federal government, that power is retained by the states respectively or by the people. And so we ought to be looking at this carefully and closely, analyzing it on our own. We can't assume that the federal courts will save us from our own unconstitutional actions. I've been critical of presidents of both political parties when they have taken actions that exceed the scope of their authority as President of the United States, or of actions enacted by the legislative branch under the direction of either political party that exceed the power of the federal government. This is an issue that's not Republican or Democratic. It's not liberal. It's not conservative. It's simply an American issue. It's a constitutional issue. And we ought to be debating and discussing these things here and not waiting for the courts to act. One of the profound frustrations that I've encountered over the years is sometimes people will conflate the issue of constitutionality with litigation. They'll assume that constitutional issues are those that have to be addressed in the courts and only in the courts. Fortunately, we have the courts to adjudicate disputes on the meaning of statutes and provisions of the Constitution. But that doesn't excuse us of our responsibility to provide an independent check and balance to make sure that authority isn't being exercised where it should not. It's especially important whereas here we're dealing with a fundamentally misguided and I believe immoral proposition. That is that individual Americans, hardworking moms and dads throughout this country, ought ever to be put into a position by their government to choose between, on the one hand, receiving a medical procedure that they may not want, or to which they may have religious or other moral objections, or to which they might have a specific health concern, for example. They ought not ever be put in a position where they have to choose between that unwanted medical procedure, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the ability to put bread on the table for their children. That's not right. The American people know it. And deep down, they know something's terribly wrong whenever one person can, with the stroke of the executive pen, issue so broad, so deep, and so immoral a mandate. I'm not going to stand for this. I'll be back. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back the next day. I'll be back as often as it takes, as long as it takes. I'm not going to stop until we win this fight. Thank you, Mr. President.